Welcome to Redacted Opinions, unfiltered, raw, and authentic. The opinions expressed on this show are those of the hosts alone. And now, let's get on with the show.
What if a foreign government didn't have to cross Canada's borders to threaten someone inside the country? What if they could intimidate a person living in Toronto, pressure their family overseas, silence a political opponent, and recruit someone here to carry out a crime, and potentially do all of that without ever putting one of their own agents at risk on Canadian soil? We tend to think of foreign interference as something happening in the shadows of elections, government offices, and intelligence agencies. Things like espionage, cyber attacks, stolen secrets, political influence, and so forth. But there is another side to this threat, one that is far more personal, and we call it transnational repression. And Canadian intelligence officials have warned that it is not a theory. It's happening today, and in the most serious cases, it can become life-threatening. In this episode, we're going to ask some uncomfortable questions. What happens when a foreign government tries to exercise power over someone living in Canada? What happens when intelligence agencies believe a threat crisis exists, but proving it in a Canadian court is another matter entirely? And perhaps the biggest question of all, if a foreign government believes it can interfere in Canada without paying a serious price, why wouldn't it? Because this isn't just about spies, it's about sovereignty and it's about rule of law. It's about whether Canadians and people living in Canada can exercise their rights without fear of consequences imposed by another government. This discussion became tragically real in Toronto just last month when an investigation connected to the shooting of the U.S. consulate ultimately intersected with the death of a Toronto police officer, Mark Pinizzotto. An officer went to work investigating serious violence and didn't come home to his family that day. In this episode of Redacted Opinions, we're looking at foreign interference, transnational repression, proxy networks, the intelligence to evidence gap, and the difficult question of what Canada should do about it. Because foreign governments are going to try to influence Canada. The real question is, do they believe Canada will make them pay a price? Do they believe Canada will make the price of doing so unacceptable? This is Redacted Opinions, Unfiltered and Raw. I'm Luciano Cedrone. Sitting across from me on the screen is Brian Claman. Brian, let's start at the most basic level. If a foreign government is intimidating or threatening someone who is living in Canada, isn't that fundamentally an attack on Canadian sovereignty?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, sovereignty is not simply about defending Canada's physical borders, okay? Sovereignty also means Canadian law applies here. Canadians and people living here should be able to exercise their legal rights without fear. Another government should not be able to extend its coercive power in Canada. Think about the practical effect. Someone may technically have freedom of speech in this country. We all do. But if they express that freedom of speech, they could suffer the consequences of some foreign entity. We do have a problem, and we got to get serious about it.
And importantly, CSIS acknowledges that this is happening. This isn't just speculation on our part. We may not be experts, as people like to say, but all you have to do is read. Look into the news, and you'll find all kinds of stories playing out that speak to this in Canada. And the Canadian Intelligence Service has publicly identified transnational repression as a national security concern. Unfortunately, I don't think our government agrees up too often. But let's bring this closer to home. On March 10th, 2026, shots were fired at the U.S. consulate in downtown Toronto. Canadian authorities treated the incident as a national security investigation, and the RCMP becoming involved. Obviously, they're our federal police service. Toronto police subsequently investigated the consulate shooting as part of a group of firearm discharge investigations that immediately raises a number of questions. Why was an American diplomatic facility in downtown Toronto targeted? And that wasn't the last time. We've had a second shooting in the last couple of weeks. So again, why are they being targeted? Who wanted the shooting carried out? Was the shooter acting independently? Were they ideologically motivated? Is it just about money? We don't know, or at least they're not sharing it with us. And ultimately, who, if anyone, was directing the activity from behind the scenes? Do we know who they are, and what are we supposed to do about that?
I think, Luke, that last question is critical. We got to be careful here because there's all sorts of speculation. We know the shooting occurred. That's a fact. We know investigators connected subsequent warrants to this investigation, outstanding warrants. But unless and until police establish who ultimately commissioned the attack, we shouldn't fill that evidentiary gap ourselves. We don't want to feed this conspiracy theory. Having said that, we've also got to be realistic. Okay. When you did investigations, when I did investigations, you follow the evidence, but if it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, you got to consider it might be a duck. And I think it would be naive to think that to not have it on your list of possible motives behind the shooting. That the person pulling the trigger may only be the last link in the chain. The police arrested for the first shooting at the concert. They shot one individual. They've arrested a second individual. These were very low-level people. Apparently, the information is released in the paper. It was a gun-for-hire type network. What is not known, who is doing the hiring. And that's really scary because that's where the thoughts of foreign interference comes in, the possibility of foreign interference comes in. In the case of the first shooting where the police officer was shot and killed regrettably, U.S. intelligence got intercepts, I think, in Pakistan, where there was known terrorists saying that it was their operation. They were responsible for that. And they're also responsible for the synagogue shootings that occurred in Toronto earlier in the week. I think it's reasonable to believe there's something happening overseas, manifesting itself in Canada.
And ultimately, these things have devastating consequences for people back in Canada. The people, to your point about it walks like a duck, talks like a duck. I don't know when it became so complicated that you can't just call it a freaking duck. Like, it is what it is. And it really undermines the ability for Canada to enforce its sovereignty when they're not willingly able to acknowledge that this is happening. And yeah, you might have to say some politically insensitive or incorrect things, but you got a country to protect. And in this case, like I said, the consequences came right back to Toronto Canadians living here in Canada, thousands of miles from those areas that you were talking about. On June 11th, 2026, Toronto police were executing a high-risk warrant in North York regarding those shootings. And Toronto Police Chief Myron Demke said the warrant concerned several shootings, including the U.S. consulate. The Emergency Task Force Constable, Mark Pinizzotto, 43, was shot during that operation, and he later died in hospital. He was an 18-year member of the Toronto Police Service. A Canadian police officer, now you can say that's part of his job, but any police officer will tell you nobody pays you to get killed. But it pisses me off a little more, to be honest, when they're executing a job that really should not have involved them to begin with. Because this, whatever it is, it's not about Canada. It's about something going on somewhere else. He should not be putting his life on the line for something that's going on halfway across the globe.
I remember when I did investigations many, many years ago, I always learned that you follow the evidence where it leads you, but you also have an open mind. And you have to ask yourself, in this case of the Toronto consulate shooting, who would want to do it? I mean, would it be kids and vandals? I guess that's a possibility. But the U.S. is currently in war in Iran. So it makes you wonder, there are a lot of people that are angry at the U.S. right now. And clearly the lowlifes that were involved in the shooting, that were one arrested in the piece of scum that killed the police officer, they're not the masterminds behind it. According to media reports, Toronto Police said, the chief said, they made about $500, $800 doing this. That was just a gun for hire network. They had no political motivation. So you talk about the Canadian police officer went to work investigating, doing his job, and he didn't come home that night. That really changes the discussion as far as I'm concerned. We're not just talking about intelligence reports, diplomatic complaints, election interference, people being followed. Police officer was killed. A Canadian citizen was killed. It could have been any one of us that was killed. And this is an important distinction. Constable Pinizzotto's death does not by itself prove the foreign interference, the foreign government was responsible for the consulate shooting. But it demonstrates that the real world consequences of investigating networks associated with serious national security related violence can come home to roost here in Canada. Threats that begin somewhere else ultimately produce consequences on a Toronto street. If you remember, when we were involved in the planning for the G20 many years ago, in the discussions we've had with our intelligence partners at that time, Toronto's such a world-class cosmopolitan city. Whatever happens on the other side of the world manifests itself almost in real time in Toronto within 24 to 48 hours. I remember so many times the National Intelligence Network INSET teams, something happens, an assassination, a terror attack somewhere in the Middle East or somewhere in Europe or somewhere in Asia. They're on it within 10 minutes and trying to figure out, is there a nexus to Canada? Is this coming? Is there a group of people in sympathy are going to do something in this city, be it a demonstration or a violent act? So we really can't be naive. We've got to stop being naive. Canada, for the longest time, didn't have a foreign
office service,
a registry where foreign applicants have to register. I was hearing the news today, the government passed one or something that looks like that, but it really just scratches the surface. It doesn't do what needs to be done. And you have to ask yourself, and I'm not suggesting any nefarious intent over here, but you have to ask yourself, what is taking so long? Why aren't we doing it? It's really simple.
I keep saying we are not a serious country. Okay. Canada acts like the little child, expecting things to be done and then complaining about them when they're not done instead of taking the lead like it used to do in the 50s and 60s. We were renowned for our peacekeeping abilities. I don't know what we're renowned for now other than money laundering and inviting all criminal networks into our country. And that creates a real problem when it comes to investigations, because while we let all these other foreign agencies come into the country, and I want to just highlight, we've spoken specifically about foreign interference in terms of governments, but that foreign interference is also criminal in nature. There's organized crime groups that are global in nature, that are operating in Canada, using us, using our people, using our youth to execute crimes, raise money so that they can facilitate criminal activity elsewhere. It's a different form of foreign influence. It presents in much the same way, and it creates a really big problem because when the police are able to identify the players, and they have, right, our cops are very good, despite what the media might say and some of the bullshit you hear out there. We have very good police officers who know how to investigate crimes. But the problem is that when the criminals don't live in Canada and they're not necessarily Canadians, it really complicates the ability for law enforcement to actually enforce the law, to take them down, put them in jail. These things will become that much more difficult to pursue and arrive at a guilty verdict because now you got to rely on foreign agencies, foreign governments to help you bring those people to justice.
Well, I think there's a major disconnect. I think what's happened is that we have, as you said, we've got a good police network or services in Canada. We've got a great intelligence group. It's not that we lack the talent, but there's a disconnect between the political will and our ability to execute. There's an indifference, okay? It's not that we don't care. We just don't think about these things. A little bit of infomercial. I talked about the last podcast. So I've got a book coming out September 8th. The title of the book is When Is It Too Late? And I'll get to the center of the book. When is it too late is when it's too late. And what worries me is with what's happening in the country right now, especially with this foreign interference thing, because we're so naive, by the time the indifference is shed, by the time we start realizing we've got a problem, it's too late. It's the cancer. It's metastasized. I mean, every terrorist group, every major transnational criminal group in the world is operating in Canada. Ask yourself, why is this? Hey, people say, well, it doesn't affect me. Well, it does affect you. It's the price of products that we're paying for. It's the intimidation of different communities. It's the inability of certain people to stand up and say what they want to say for fear of being shaken down. It's fear. We're a country of immigrants. If someone comes up to you and says, hey, I know you're not scared, but your uncle or aunt or kid or mother or father is back in Italy or back in India or Pakistan, we can get to them. We know where they live. That's going to affect your so-called freedoms in this country. If we don't wake up, when is it too late? This indifference has to be blown away. We got to get serious about this stuff.
We are a minor league team playing in the big boys league. That's what Canada is. I think the problem is that when you've got leaders who don't even acknowledge that a Canadian identity exists, let's start with that. At the top of the mountain, you've got a problem. But I think more so in the way the country came together, it didn't fight for anything. It was given. We were given our independence from the British. We didn't have to fight for that. We had no civil war to solidify a personality like the US, like almost every other country in the world has had to do. And when you go through those types of trials and tribulations, you become very attached to your national persona. That develops your identity. That creates the pride and the affection for the country, the flag. And when you have governments that slam the country instead of promote it, like we've had over the last 10, 15 years, it only constitutes like nobody cares. To your point, people become indifferent. If the Canadian government doesn't care about Canada, then why the hell should I? As long as I can get my Frappuccino at Starbucks without having to wait for it and pay my $4 and be on my way to my 9-to-5 job, that's Canada. It's very bland. That's what I see right now. Think about what's happened in the last 2 to 5 years in this country. It hasn't been just the Russians, right? They're the ones who has a history of spycraft, all the secret agents. But the Chinese have been just as prevalent, if not more so. We had police officers, Chinese police stations operating on Canadian soil. What happened to that discussion? It just went off the radar. No big deal. Who cares? Are you kidding me?
Doesn't affect me. I'm not Chinese.
A Canadian police station operating in China, how that would be received? And then you talk about India. We can go all the way back to the Pan Am bombings and the Canadian
Well,
portion to that.
or Air India.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Air India. Sorry, I had the wrong airline. That's exactly
Yeah.
what I was talking about. We go back, that's the 1980s. It's not
That's
something
right.
that's new to Canada. And now we've got Iran. We've got all kinds of infiltration on our streets, all those protests. Where do you think that money's coming from? Somebody's funding that activity and promoting that type of behavior. And yet the Canadian government, silent. I don't want to scare people. I don't want to piss people off. As long as I'm getting my pay, I guess as long as they check in for their 9-to-5 job, they're happy. What other explanation can there be, Brian? She says, tell them what the risks are. And they're very real. And yet the government insists on ignoring all that.
It's indifference. It doesn't affect me day to day. I'll be able to go to the Starbucks drive-thru, get my cappuccino. It does not affect my life. But the thing that they're missing is it does. You know, you've got to ask yourself, what is it that you got to ask yourself? And if we have multiple countries doing this, Luke, and we know that we do, why does Canada remain an attractive place to operate? Okay, well, I'll tell you why. Ask the question, I'll give you the answer, at least the answer as I see it. Put yourself in the position of a hostile foreign intelligence service. You conduct a basic risk assessment. The calculation is, what do I gain? Versus, what is the probability I'll be caught? Versus, what happens if I'm caught? Look at what you gain. Canada is one of the wealthiest, technologically advanced countries in the world. We're a neighbor to the United States of America, which is the focus of every intelligence agency in the world. There's a lot to gain. This is a land of milk and honey when it comes to intelligence, industrial intelligence, military intelligence, criminal intelligence. What happens if I get caught? Let's think about that. This is Canada. Nothing happens if you get caught. So when you look at foreign intelligence services operating the world, I just watched a Netflix special on the Lockerbie bombing that took place in the 80s. That was the Pan Am plane that
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah, that's the one you were thinking of. It was Libyan terrorists, okay? Well, it was not Libyan terrorists. They were Libyan intelligence officers that were behind that. And those that got caught, and surprisingly, like 30, 40 years later, there's still a criminal trial that's going to start just this year in 2026. But they got 25 years. One got life. That's what they got. If you had an American intelligence officer or another foreign service intelligence officer, British or Israeli or whatever, get caught in Libya or Iraq or other countries, they die. That's consequences. Dissidents, okay, in Tiananmen Square in China years ago when they had the student revolution. What were the consequences of taking that? They die. They go to jail for a very long time and their fingernails get pulled out. What is the detriment against doing foreign interference in Canada? Nada, nothing. You probably get elected to some political party, become a cabinet minister. Like, this is the problem. There's no consequence. The primary consequence might be diplomatic criticism. Wow, that's pretty scary.
It's heavy.
Like Trudeau when he told India after the shooting, well, he was in power. Yeah, don't do that again. Temporary political dispute. We told the Chinese, didn't we? Trudeau was there and he says, you got to take care of your people. You got to bring in democratic principles. I know they were really quaking in their boots after Canada agreed in this condemnation. Perhaps an expulsion. Well, that really would scare me. I'm a foreign intelligence officer. I get caught compromising the security of Canada, perhaps perpetrating a crime against a Canadian citizen, and you're going to kick me out? Where do I sign up? Perhaps sanctions. And we know that doesn't really work. How sanctions worked against the Russians after the invasion of Ukraine. So a hostile state may simply view these consequences as an acceptable risk. It's just the cost of doing business. And I would say it's a very low cost.
Well, yeah, no cost. So perhaps the question isn't why are foreign governments intervening in Canada? The better question might be, why wouldn't they? If they believe they can get away with it. And everything that we do supports that view. Look at going back to Huawei. Remember when they arrested the CEO of Huawei? She was under house arrest in her freaking luxury home in Vancouver. Meanwhile, the two Michaels who were arrested for absolutely no reason spent 2 years in prison, and Chinese prison, not a freaking mansion like she did. And we actually let her go before those guys were released, right?
Yeah.
So what does that tell you? And then what about our banking system? We talk only about government. How about the banking system and the money coming in from Chinese real estate, the laundering accusations? You've got the $700 million lawsuit that came out of the US against a major Canadian bank for knowingly laundering money. Like, our institutions are part of the problem. And I think they're just a reflection of the government who doesn't regulate the way they should. And the institutions get that. And they play, I mean, they're like anything else. The only difference between a criminal organization and a legitimate organization, on which side of the law you claim to be on. But there's also another side to this. We've talked about the fact that we don't punish anybody in Canada. Certainly not, well, we punish the everyday citizen, but we don't punish anybody beyond that. So that leads us to another aspect of this, and that is that Canada can't simply arrest people because they think they're going to be doing something. Some of the challenges to that when it comes to bringing these people to justice, or at least kicking them out of the country.
Well, I think many of our listeners, well, intelligence is not evidence, and there is a different bar. Intelligence is something that's probable and it's validated by multiple sources, but it's not evidence-based. It's not at the bar high enough to lay a charge. And even if it was, CSIS, for example, our national intelligence organization, often wouldn't want to do that because that compromises bigger investigations that they're doing. Evidence is what the police do. They gather evidence to lay a charge. Imagine if CSIS receives highly credible information from, let's say, a human source or an allied intelligence service or a classified intercept, okay? That information may convince intelligence officials there's a threat to Canada, that the threat is real, but revealing it could compromise the investigation, could make that source go underground. So they can't act on that. What they do is they advise government that we have reason to believe with a high probability that there's a threat to this country, which they do every single day. But for some reason, government doesn't listen. They don't do anything about it. So, I hear this often when people say they'll criticize when CSIS suggested foreign interference of India and other countries. I've heard MPs and cabinet ministers talk about, well, if there was evidence, we would charge people. You'll never get evidence with intelligence because that's not what intelligence is about.
I think the biggest problem with our government when it comes to this is that they politicize the process, and it shouldn't be politicized. I believe 100% in the US, when they figured out where Osama bin Laden was, it didn't matter if they were Republicans or Democrats. That guy was dead. They would have ordered that hit no matter who was in power. Where here, that would have been a political discussion. Well, we're the liberals. We're going to give him a hug and send him on his merry way. The conservatives might think, well, we're going to go after him type thing. It's muddied the waters. Once you're in government, your sole responsibility should be based on what is the best for Canada. End of story. I don't care what your political stripes are, but you should be fighting for what's best for the country. And that's where I think we've lost focus. It's become everything we do now is all about politics at all levels. They politicized everything and they threw economics out the window.
We're really naive. I saw a thing on, I think it was Instagram or YouTube, about some demonstration. Someone was asked about where government funding should go, and where, I think it was in the States in Washington, they were talking about the money that goes in the military. And this one young, idealistic, naive person would say, well, I wish we wouldn't spend money on the military. I wish we put money into housing. I wish we put money into education. Look, those are all worthy things, but that presupposes that there's a world out there where everyone is singing Kumbaya and they want only the best. There are real bad people and actors in the world. And the only reason we have a military, and certainly the main reason we should have a military in this country, is to protect us from these bad actors. And we don't need every single Canadian to understand that there's bad actors and what the threats are. We need to have trust in our intelligence community, in our policing community, in our partners, and then we need politicians that are going to act on that so that I don't have to worry about that in my day-to-day life. But it comes back to indifference. It comes back to naiveness. Of course, I'd rather spend money on things that didn't have to do with guns and soldiers and airplanes and Navy ships, but that's not the world we live in.
No, I go back to our podcast, I think last episode, where we talked about the power and peace. Peace has always been maintained at the point of a spear. If there's no risk of violence, people will do whatever the hell they want. The strongest will always take over. The most greedy will always take over. Like, this naivety is only developed because we've had relative peace. For almost 100 years now. We're coming, 1940. So yeah, almost 100 years of relative peace, at least in Canada and the US. So they don't know what it's like to have to fight for a piece of bread. I think Canadians have never really experienced that. And I think that's big problems, because when you finally get punched in the face, then you go, oh, I'm going to call 911 now. Well, then 911, you voted to have them defunded 2 years ago. So they're not, like New York's doing now, right? Mandami, he wants to defund the police. Good luck. That's going to be the 1970s all over again.
People have to understand.
Go ahead. I was just going to say, how do you think we can fix this, given all these issues?
Well, listen, I think for starters, I think people have to wake up and realize peace and the life that we enjoy in Canada, most Western democracies, is not a natural state. It's not natural.
Yeah.
I mean, it's here because of the blood, sweat, and sacrifice of young people in wars before us. And what's really smug that we sit there and we criticize and you say, well, what about this guy? What, he's just doesn't mean anything. He doesn't. We only have freedom, as you said, because of the pointy edge of the spear, because of the sacrifice people made before us. And as that memory becomes more distant, and we don't teach history, we don't teach values anymore in school, we're going to lose that. We're going to lose that piece. The peace dividend has an best before date. If you're not always renewing it, as we're not, we're going to lose it. And the U.S. is a great example. Not to make this about Trump or anything, but what he has done is he's really, like an elastic band, taken the freedoms that are enshrined in the Constitution, has really stretched them to the breaking point. It's still to be seen what happens in that country. Democracy and freedom and peace is something that if you're not trying to maintain every day, you're going to lose it. The cancer is going to sneak in and take it away. So what has to be done is you've got to wake up, because again, my book, When Is It Too Late, looks at really the lessons of the Holocaust. And one of the lessons is, think about it, okay? Poland fell in 1939. Hungary fell in 1944. In between that period of time, there were Jewish communities throughout Europe that were falling. People were being killed. And other countries that weren't invaded yet kept thinking, well, it's not going to affect us. It's not our problem. It won't happen to us. And by the time it happened to them, it was too late. That message applies here. What has to happen is we have to wake up as a people, and we have to trust our institutions. And if we don't trust the institutions, and there's a reason not to trust it, let's fix the institutions. And then let the professionals, and this is not the US, this is Canada, and I do trust our institutions. In fact, they're incredible. Let them do their job and let our political leaders benefit from their expertise. I don't want the intelligence community, I don't want CSIS and the different security apparatus to be calling the shots, but I do want our political elected leaders to listen to what they say, not do what they tell them, but really take under critique, under consideration in a serious way, what they're being told, because they don't know. You were selling used cars before you were the Minister of Finance. This is what these guys have done their whole career.
That's sadly true. How many baristas? It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And now they're running our country. But okay, so on today's episode, we start with a concept that can sound almost abstract. We call it foreign interference. But by now, I think it's clear that there's nothing abstract about it. It can mean someone being watched, someone being threatened, the family being pressured, the person being forced into silence. And in the most serious circumstances, it can mean violence. The uncomfortable reality is that Canada's borders don't necessarily stop foreign governments from exercising power here. They can use intermediaries, they can use criminal networks, they can use online platforms, and they can use people who may not even understand who is ultimately behind the instructions. And that creates a very different kind of national security challenge. Because the person standing in front of a Canadian court may be the person who carried out the act, but not necessarily the person who conceived it, funded it, or ordered it. Any thoughts, Brian?
No, I think you said it. I couldn't say it better.
Let me take it.
No, I usually don't agree with you, but yeah, that summarizes the situation really well.
All right. Well, then I'll just finish off with the fact that sovereignty is not just a line on the map. Sovereignty is the ability to live under Canadian law without another government exercising coercive power over us from somewhere else. And maybe that's the real test. Not whether foreign governments will try to interfere. They will. That you can be assured of. Not whether they will try to exploit weaknesses, because they will. The real question is whether Canada is prepared to make the cost of doing so high enough that they think twice. Because if a foreign government can reach into Toronto, intimidate someone into silence, recruit someone to commit violence, or threaten a family thousands of kilometers away and believe there will be no consequences, then the question isn't whether foreign interference is happening. The question is how much power we've allowed it to have. That's Redacted Opinions. What do you think? Let us know in the comments. Like our episodes if you like what you're hearing. I'm Luciano, Cedrone, with me, Brian Claman. This was Redacted Opinions, Unfiltered and Raw. Until next time, stay informed, question everything, and never assume the threat is as far away as it looks.
Have a good week, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you for listening to Redacted Opinions. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed our podcast to help build our audience. Tune in next week for another episode of Redacted Opinions.